Miss Marple, Silent Night, Deadly Night. Welcome to Warm Pages, I'm Edward. Are you counting the days to the winter holidays, New Year and Christmas, or do you prefer the easy warmth of summertime? Tell us below, and don't forget to subscribe so our cosy community can keep growing. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Candlelight in the Nave. The church of St. Mary Mead stood silent beneath a darkening sky, its ancient stones wrapped in the hush that comes only on Christmas Eve, when snow begins to fall. Miss Jane Marple, her white hair neatly arranged beneath a small velvet hat, paused at the lich gate to admire the scene before her. The windows glowed with warm candlelight, and through the oak doors came the faint sound of organ music, a prelude to the midnight service that had drawn the village together for generations. She was not alone in her appreciation. Several villagers clustered near the entrance, stamping their feet against the cold and exchanging greetings in hushed, reverent tones. Miss Marple recognised Mrs. Bantry, her friend and neighbour, swathed in furs and looking rather like a benevolent Russian empress. "Jane, dear, isn't it perfect?" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, linking arms with her. "Though I do hope the snow doesn't worsen. Colonel Bantry insisted on walking and his boots leak abominably." "Snow on Christmas Eve always seems providential," Miss Marple observed mildly, allowing herself to be guided up the path. "Though I confess I'm reminded of the year old Mr. Harmon slipped on the church steps and blamed Providence rather loudly for his broken ankle." Mrs. Bantry laughed, and they passed through the great doors into the nave. The interior of the church was quite transformed. Candles flickered on every windowsill and lined the altar rail, their flames casting dancing shadows across the ancient pillars. The scent of pine and beeswax mingled with the mustiness of old prayer books and the faint sweetness of incense. Wreaths of holly adorned the walls, and the great brass lectern gleamed in the candlelight. It was, Miss Marple thought, precisely as Christmas should be. The pews were filling rapidly. She nodded to Dr. Haydock, the village physician, who sat near the middle with his wife. Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, occupied her usual position on the far side, her sharp eyes already cataloguing who had arrived and with whom. Young Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, moved gracefully among the congregation, ensuring that the elderly were comfortably seated and that the order of service had been distributed. Miss Marple settled herself into a pew some 4 rows from the front, a position that afforded an excellent view of both the choir stalls and the altar. Mrs. Bantry rustled in beside her, and Colonel Bantry, having finally arrived, squeezed past them with muttered apologies. "The choir boys look angelic, don't they?" Mrs. Bantry whispered, gesturing toward the robed figures now filing into their places. "Though I've heard young Timothy Southers was caught smoking behind the village hall last week." Miss Marple's eyes, shrewd behind their gentle expression, moved thoughtfully over the choir. There were 6 boys in all, ranging in age from perhaps 10 to 15. They wore white surplices over red cassocks, and their faces shone with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Timothy Southers, the eldest, was a tall, gangly youth with sandy hair, who kept his eyes fixed firmly on his hymnal. Beside him, young Peter Wickham fidgeted with the ribbon marking his place, while the smallest boy, Robin Ashby, gazed about him with wide, wondering eyes. "Boys will be boys," Miss Marple murmured. "I recall my nephew Raymond at that age. Most angelic in appearance on Sundays, yet I discovered he had been systematically raiding my kitchen for cake every Thursday afternoon. The crumbs in his pockets quite gave him away." Behind the choir boys, in the more elevated stalls, sat the adult members of the choir. Miss Marple recognised most of them. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose soprano voice was more enthusiastic than accurate, Mr. Hughes Curl from the solicitor's office, young Miss Hartwell, who blushed whenever anyone looked at her, and several others whose names escaped her at present. At the organ, his back to the congregation, sat Mr. Jonas Leach. He was a lean, angular man of perhaps 45, with thinning dark hair and a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles. His fingers moved over the keys with mechanical precision, though Miss Marple fancied she detected a certain tension in his shoulders, She had always thought him a rather colourless individual, competent but uninspired. It was said he supplemented his modest income by giving piano lessons to the village children, though few parents seemed eager to engage him. The vicar, the Reverend Clement, appeared from the vestry in his white and gold vestments, his pleasant face beaming with the joy of the season. He took his place before the altar and raised his hands in welcome. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying warmly through the nave, "on this most blessed of nights, we gather to celebrate the miracle of our Saviour's birth. Let us prepare our hearts for worship with prayer and with song." As he spoke, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the choirmaster's position at the front of the choir stalls. Mr. Alfred Prowse had not yet appeared, which was most unusual. Prowse was a man of rigid habits, known throughout the village for his punctuality and his exacting standards. He had led the St. Mary Mead Choir for nearly 20 years, transforming it from a mediocre collection of voices into something approaching respectability. A stir among the choir boys suggested that she was not alone in noticing his absence. Timothy Southers glanced toward the vestry door with an expression Miss Marple could not quite read. Was it anxiety or perhaps relief? Young Peter Wickham elbowed the boy beside him and whispered something that earned him a sharp look from Mrs. Price Ridley. The vestry door opened and Mr. Prowse emerged at last. He was a stout man of some 60 years, with a florid complexion and thick white hair, brushed back from a high forehead. His bearing had always been one of confidence bordering on pomposity, but tonight there was something altered about him. His face seemed drawn, and his eyes, usually so commanding during rehearsals, darted about the church with an oddly distracted air. He carried his music folder clutched tightly against his chest, and moved to his position with less than his customary authority. Miss Marple watched him with interest. She had known Alfred Prowse for many years, had observed him at countless services and village functions, and she had formed certain opinions about his character. He was a man who enjoyed authority, who took pride in his position and the deference it commanded. He could be severe with those who failed to meet his standards, particularly the choir boys, yet he could also be generous in his praise when it was deserved. There had been talk some months ago of a dispute with the church council over the music budget, but Miss Marple had paid little attention to village gossip on that score. Tonight, however, Prowse appeared almost diminished. As he took his place and laid his folder on the stand before him, his hands trembled slightly. He glanced toward the organ, and Miss Marple observed a brief charged moment as his eyes met those of Jonas Leach. Something passed between them, recognition, resentment, or perhaps fear, before both men looked quickly away. How very interesting, Miss Marple thought. Rather like the time Mr. Cahor, Petherick and Dr. Stone refused to speak to one another at the church fete, and it later transpired they had quarrelled over the affections of the new schoolmistress. The service proceeded with its familiar rhythms. Prayers were offered, lessons read, and carols sung with varying degrees of skill. The snow continued to fall outside, visible through the high windows as it drifted past the coloured glass. The candles burned lower, and the church grew warmer with the press of bodies and the weight of collective breath. Throughout it all, Miss Marple found her attention returning to Alfred Prowse. He conducted the choir with his usual gestures, yet there was a mechanical quality to his movements, as though his thoughts were elsewhere entirely. Once, during a particularly beautiful rendition of O Come All Ye Faithful, she saw him press his hand briefly to his chest and his face paled. Dr. Haydock, she noted, had also observed this and was frowning slightly. During the final carol before the sermon, Miss Marple noticed something else. One of the choir boys, Timothy Southers again, kept glancing at Prowse with an expression of barely suppressed agitation. And there, in the last pew near the door, sat a figure she did not recognise, a man in a long dark coat, quite alone, who seemed to be watching the choirmaster with singular intensity. The Reverend Clement concluded his sermon with a blessing, and the congregation settled into expectant silence. The moment had arrived for the evening's culmination, the singing of Silent Night by candlelight. It was the tradition that on this hymn all other lights would be dimmed, leaving only the candles to illuminate the church, while the choir's voices rose in perfect harmony. Mr. Prowse stepped forward, raising his hand to signal the beginning. The church lights were lowered, shadows leapt and danced across the ancient stones, and in that moment Miss Marple noticed the faint, acrid scent that seemed to emanate from somewhere near the choir stalls, a smell she associated with garden sheds and autumn burnings, metallic and oddly wrong in this sacred space. Mr. Prowse's hand remained elevated, ready to bring the choir in on the first note. Then, quite suddenly, his face contorted. His hand fell. He staggered backward, gasping, and collapsed heavily into his seat, his head falling forward onto his chest. In the candle-lit silence, someone screamed. Chapter 2. The Choirmaster Who Fell. The scream came from Mrs. Price Ridley, whose soprano had never been more effectively deployed. It seemed to release the congregation from their paralysis, and suddenly the church erupted into movement and noise. Several men rose from their pews and hurried toward the choir stalls. Women clutched at one another. The choir boys, their angelic composure shattered, pressed backward against the organ in a confused huddle. Miss Marple remained quite still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving rapidly from face to face, from figure to figure as the scene unfolded before her. She had learned long ago that in moments of crisis, one learned most by observing rather than by participating in the general commotion. "Make way, please, I'm a doctor!" Dr. Haydock's authoritative voice cut through the confusion as he made his way forward. The vicar had already reached Mr. Prowse and was kneeling beside him, his face stricken with concern. "Alfred? Alfred? Can you hear me?" The Reverend Clement touched the choirmaster's shoulder gently, but there was no response. Prowse had slumped completely in his seat, his head lolling forward, one hand dangling limply at his side. Dr. Haydock knelt and placed his fingers against Prowse's neck, searching for a pulse. The silence that fell over the church was more profound than any that had preceded it. Miss Marple watched the doctor's face intently and saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the minute shake of his head that he could not quite suppress. "I'm afraid," Dr. Haydock said quietly, rising to his feet. "There's nothing to be done. He's gone." The vicar made the sign of the cross. "God rest his soul," he murmured. Then more loudly, addressing the congregation, "Please, everyone, remain calm. If you would all stay seated for just a moment while we attend to this tragic situation." But calm was not easily achieved. Mrs. Price Ridley was weeping loudly. Several of the choir boys were crying as well, and young Robin Ashby looked as though he might be sick. Jonas Leach had risen from the organ bench and stood white-faced and motionless, his mouth slightly open, staring at the fallen man. A stroke, surely? Colonel Bantry had moved to stand beside de Haydock. Poor devil, seemed perfectly well earlier. "Possibly," de Haydock said, but his tone was guarded. He bent again to examine the body, and Miss Marple observed that his attention had been caught by something. He lifted Prowse's right hand, studying it with a frown, then let it fall gently back. Miss Marple rose from her pew. Mrs. Bantry clutched at her sleeve. "Jane, where are you going? Surely we should do as the vicar says, and—" "I shall only be a moment, dear," Miss Marple said softly. "I believe I may be of some small assistance." She made her way forward with quiet determination, her slight figure easily overlooked in the confusion. The vicar was attempting to organise the removal of the body to the vestry, while Dr. Haydock conferred with him in low tones. Miss Marple positioned herself unobtrusively near the choir stalls, close enough to observe without interfering. From this vantage point, several things became apparent to her practised eye. Mr. Prowse's music folder had fallen to the floor when he collapsed, and sheets of music lay scattered about his feet. His hymnal, however, remained on the stand before him, open to the page for Silent Night. The book was one of the church's own, bound in dark green cloth with gilt lettering on the spine, but something about it struck Miss Marple as peculiar. The hymnal on the stand beside it, the one that belonged to Mrs. Price Ridley's position, was identical in appearance, yet somehow the two books seemed wrong together, as though they ought not to be in that particular arrangement. She moved a fraction closer, ostensibly to avoid a choir boy who was being led past her by Miss Hartwell. Now she could see the hymnal more clearly. Between its pages, just visible, was what appeared to be a pressed sprig of greenery. The leaves were dark and glossy, arranged in a distinctive pattern she recognised immediately. Yew. A sprig of yew pressed carefully between the pages. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her mind worked rapidly. Yew was poisonous, extremely so. Every part of the plant contained toxins that could kill a grown man. She had seen a case once, years ago, when a foolish young gardener's boy had eaten the berries on a dare. He had died within hours, despite all efforts to save him. She glanced toward the haydock, who was now straightening up from his examination. His face was troubled, and he beckoned the vicar aside. "Clement," he said quietly, "oui," though Miss Marple's sharp ears caught every word. "I'm not entirely satisfied this was a natural death. There are certain signs, the discoloration of the fingertips, the smell about his clothing that suggest possible poisoning." The vicar paled. "Poisoning? But surely, good heavens, you don't mean deliberate poisoning?" "I mean that I cannot certify this as a simple stroke without further investigation. The body will need to be examined properly. We must notify the police." Miss Marple withdrew discreetly as the two men continued their discussion. She had observed what she needed to observe, and there was nothing to be gained by drawing attention to herself at present. She noted other details as she returned to her pew. Jonas Leach had not moved from his position near the organ. His face was a curious mixture of shock and something else. Relief, perhaps? Or was it fear? Young Timothy Sathers stood apart from the other choir boys, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes fixed on the hymnal that still lay open on the stand. And there, near the back of the church, the stranger in the dark coat was rising from his pew, preparing to leave. Miss Marple altered her course slightly, moving to intercept him. He was a man of perhaps perhaps 40, lean and dark-haired, with the sort of nondescript features that would be easily forgotten. His coat was indeed dusted with snow, and he carried a leather folio tucked under one arm. "A terrible tragedy," Miss Marple observed gently as she drew near him. "Did you know Mr. Prowse well?" The man started slightly as though he had not expected to be addressed. "No," he said shortly. "That is, I had never met him. I was merely attending the service." "How very unfortunate that your first visit to our church should be marked by such a dreadful event. You are staying in the village, perhaps?" But the stranger was already moving past her, his manner unmistakably dismissive. "Excuse me," he muttered, and hurried toward the door. Miss Marple watched him go with considerable interest. His behaviour was decidedly odd, not the reaction of a casual visitor at all. There was guilt in his manner, or at the very least unease. "Miss Marple!" The vicar had approached her, his kind face drawn with distress. "This is all so dreadful. Dr. Haydock believes, well, he has concerns about the nature of Mr. Prowse's death. The police must be notified, I'm afraid. We shall have to ask everyone to remain until they arrive." "Of course," Miss Marple said soothingly, "though I believe one gentleman has already departed. The man in the dark coat who sat in the last pew. I'm afraid I don't know his name." The vicar looked toward the door, now closed again. "I didn't recognise him either. A visitor, I suppose. Oh dear, I should have. But in all the confusion, don't distress yourself," Miss Marple said. "I'm sure the police will locate him if necessary. Tell me, had Mr. Prowse seemed unwell to you earlier this evening?" The vicar considered. "No, I can't say that he did. He arrived somewhat later than usual, I recall. The choir was already assembled when he came from the vestry, but he conducted the early carols competently enough, though now that you mention it, he did seem rather distracted. Not quite himself." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She glanced back toward the choir stalls, where de Haydock was now covering the body with his own overcoat. The dark smudges on Prowse's fingertips had been quite visible, she recalled, and that faint metallic smell that she had noticed just before he fell. It had emanated from somewhere near him. She was certain of it now. Not from the candles, nor from the holly and pine, something else entirely. Something that spoke not of accident or natural causes, but of careful, deliberate planning. Mrs. Bantry appeared at her elbow, looking thoroughly shaken. "Jane, this is too horrible. To think that poor Mr. Prowse should die here in church on Christmas Eve, and Dr. Haydock is talking about poison. Surely he must be mistaken." "I'm afraid," Miss Marple said gently, "that Dr. Haydock is very rarely mistaken about such matters. He has seen a great deal in his years of practice. But who would poison Alfred Prowse? He was a difficult man at times, certainly, rather sharp with the choir boys, and he could be quite demanding about musical standards, but to murder him?" Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Her eyes had returned to the hymnal on the stand, to the sprig of yew pressed between its pages like a macabre bookmark. She thought of the stranger who had fled, of Jonas Leach's peculiar expression, of Timothy Sother's clenched fists and fixed stare. "Human nature," she said at last, very softly, "is capable of extraordinary things, my dear, both wonderful and terrible. I have observed that the motives for murder are often quite ordinary. Fear, greed, jealousy, revenge. The setting may be sacred, but the human heart remains stubbornly fallible." Outside, the snow continued to fall on the silent village. Inside the church of St. Mary Mead, the candles burned lower, and Christmas Eve had become something else entirely. Chapter 3. The hymnal out of place. The police arrived within the hour, in the person of Constable Polk, whose bicycle could be heard crunching through the snow long before he appeared at the church door. He was a solid, dependable man who had served St. Mary Mead for 15 years, and his presence had a calming effect on the more agitated members of the congregation. Inspector Slack from Much Benham followed some 20 minutes later in a motor car, bringing with him the particular brand of aggressive efficiency that Miss Marple had encountered on previous occasions. He was a thin, sharp-featured man with a manner that suggested he considered most civilians to be either fools or obstacles to his investigation. "Right then," he announced, striding into the church and surveying the scene with evident displeasure. "I understand we have a suspicious death. Everyone is to remain exactly where they are until I've taken statements." This pronouncement caused considerable dismay among those congregation members who had been hoping to return home to their interrupted Christmas Eve celebrations. Miss Marple, however, remained perfectly content in her pew, her hands folded, her expression one of mild interest. Dr. Haydock conferred with Inspector Slack in low tones near the choir stalls. Miss Marple observed the inspector's sceptical expression gradually transform into something approaching concern as the doctor detailed his finding. She saw him bend to examine the body himself, saw his frown deepen as he noted the discoloured fingertips and caught, presumably, that faint metallic odour that lingered about the deceased. "Poison, you say?" Slack's voice carried more than he perhaps intended. "You're certain of that?" "I cannot be entirely certain without a proper examination," de Haydock replied, "but the signs are strongly suggestive. The rapidity of the collapse, the discoloration, the smell, all consistent with certain plant toxins." Miss Marple rose quietly from her pew. The inspector was now occupied with barking instructions at Constable Polk regarding the preservation of the scene and the taking of names. It seemed an opportune moment for a brief examination of the choir stalls. She moved with the unobtrusive efficiency of an elderly lady who appeared to be merely shifting position for comfort, and found herself quite naturally near the music stand where Alfred Prowse had stood. The hymnal remained open to the page for Silent Night, and the pressed sprig of yew was still visible between the pages. But now, examining it more closely in the improved light, for someone had thought to brighten the church lamps again, Miss Marple observed something else. On the corner of the page, just at the edge, where fingers would naturally grip to turn it, was a dark smudge. It was not ink, nor was it the simple dirt that might accumulate on a well-used book. The texture was waxy, blackened, and it had a faint sheen to it. She bent closer, careful not to touch the book itself. Yes, there could be no doubt. It was wax of some kind, but not the clean white or cream colour of candle wax. This was darker, almost black, and it had left a distinct thumbprint. Her eyes moved to the music stand itself, and here she made her second discovery of the evening. The stand bore a small brass plate engraved with the initials J.L. Jonas Leach. This was the organist's music stand, positioned as it was directly before the organ bench. Yet Alfred Prowse had been conducting from this position. His own stand, which she now saw stood vacant one position to the left, bore the initials AP on its corresponding brass plate. Someone had switched the hymnals, or perhaps someone had switched the positions. But why? "Miss Marple!" Inspector Slack's voice was sharp with irritation. "I must ask you to return to your seat. This is a crime scene, and I cannot have people wandering about contaminating evidence." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple said with gentle apology. "I was merely concerned that I might have dropped my service sheet. These old eyes, you know, and the poor light." She returned to her pew, but not before she had caught the expression on Jonas Leach's face. He was watching her with an intensity that bordered on panic, his pale eyes fixed on her retreating figure. When their gazes met briefly, he looked away with a jerk, as though burned. Most interesting, Miss Marple thought. Rather like the time Mrs. Elliot's maid had been caught stealing silver, and had that same trapped, desperate look when she realised someone had noticed the pattern of her movements. Mrs. Bantry leaned close. "What did you see, Jane? You had that look. The one you get when you've noticed something significant." "The hymnal is out of place," Miss Marple murmured. "Mr. Sear Prowse was conducting from Mr. Leach's music stand. I wonder why. Perhaps they simply move things about for convenience? Perhaps. Though Mr. Prowse was rather particular about such matters, I believe. I recall Miss Hartwell mentioning that he insisted everyone maintain their assigned positions in the choir. He considered it essential for proper balance." Inspector Slack had now begun his interrogation of the witnesses, starting with the vicar. The Reverend Clement, still visibly shaken, did his best to recount the events of the evening. Yes, Mr. Prowse had arrived somewhat later than usual. No, he had not seemed particularly ill, though he had appeared distracted. The service had proceeded normally until the moment of collapse. "And this business about the lights being dimmed?" Slack demanded. "That was planned, was it?" "Oh yes, it's our tradition for Silent Night. The church lights are lowered, leaving only the candles. It creates a most beautiful effect." "And who controls these lights?" "Well, that would be young Timothy Southers. He operates the switch in the vestry. He dims them on the signal from the carillon bell, 3 chimes to indicate the final hymn." Slack turned his sharp gaze on Timothy, who stood miserably with the other choir boys. "You boy, did you notice anything unusual this evening?" Timothy's face flushed. "No, sir. That is, I did as I always do. I waited for the bell and then dimmed the lights." "And the bell chimed properly?" "Well, it was a bit odd, sir. It sort of stuttered, like it wasn't working quite right. But it chimed 3 times eventually, so I dimmed the lights as I was meant to." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A stuttering bell. How very curious. Inspector Slack questioned each of the choir boys in turn, but they had little to add. They had been focused on their music, on maintaining their positions, on not disappointing Mr. Prowse with any errors. Young Robin Ashby burst into tears when asked about the choirmaster's collapse, and had to be comforted by Miss Hartwell. It was when Slack turned his attention to Jonas Leach that the atmosphere in the church perceptibly changed. "Mr. Leach, I understand you are the church organist?" "Yes." Leach's voice was barely audible. His hands, Miss Marple noted, were trembling. "How long have you held this position?" 7 years. "And your relationship with the deceased? Was it cordial? A pause fractionally too long. We worked together satisfactorily?" "That's not quite what I asked. Were you friends?" "We were colleagues. Mr. Prowse was a difficult man to befriend. He had exacting standards." "I see. And did you have any disagreements with him recently?" Leach's face went, if possible, even paler. "No more than the usual professional differences. Mr. Prowse often had opinions about tempos and interpretations. We did not always agree. Were you near him at any point before the service began? Yes, briefly. We conferred about the music for the evening. And did you touch anything of his? His music, his clothing? I may have handed him his folder. I don't recall precisely. Inspector Slack made a note in his book, his expression suggesting he found Leach's vagueness highly suspicious. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Prowse's demeanour this evening? He seemed preoccupied, perhaps anxious, but then he often was before important services. Miss Marple observed this exchange with considerable interest. Mr. Leach was lying, or at the very least concealing something significant. His discomfort was palpable, and his answers had the quality of statements carefully prepared in advance. When the inspector finally dismissed him, Leach hurried back to the organ bench and sat with his head bowed, the very picture of misery. Miss Marple turned her attention to the other members of the choir. Mrs. Price Ridley had recovered from her initial shock and was now providing Inspector Slack with a detailed and largely irrelevant account of her long association with the church music programme. Miss Hartwell answered questions in monosyllables, her face pink with embarrassment at being the centre of attention. Mr. de Curl, the solicitor, was precise and factual, noting that he had observed nothing unusual until the moment of Mr. Prowse's collapse. It was approaching 2 o'clock in the morning when Inspector Slack finally announced that the congregation might leave, having taken all their particulars. The body had been removed to Dr. Haydock's surgery for examination. The church would remain closed until further notice. As the villagers filed out into the snow-covered night, Miss Marple lingered for a moment. Inspector Slack was conferring with Constable Polk near the altar, and neither paid her any attention. She moved once more to the choir stalls, her eyes on that tellingly misplaced hymnal. The sprig of yew pressed between its pages spoke volumes to anyone who knew how to listen. Someone had placed it there deliberately, had prepared this instrument of death with care and calculation. The blackened wax on the page corner suggested handling by someone whose fingers bore some unusual substance, and the fact that the hymnal rested on Jonas Leach's stand rather than Alfred Prowse's own suggested a deliberate exchange, a switching that had occurred during that brief moment when the lights were dimmed. But when had the exchange taken place, and how had the murderer ensured that Prowse would handle the poisoned pages? Miss Marple's mind worked methodically through the possibilities. The lights had been dimmed during the signal for silent night. In that moment of darkness, with all attention focused forward towards the choir, someone could have moved quite easily, could have reached out, could have switched 2 identical hymnals, could have ensured that Alfred Prowse would grip the poisoned page precisely where the toxin had been applied. She thought of the stuttering bell that Timothy had mentioned. 3 chimes, but not quite right, almost as though someone had interfered with the mechanism, had needed to control the precise timing of that darkness. Find what you were looking for, Miss Marple? She turned to find Dr. Haydock regarding her with a mixture of amusement and respect. I have found several things that interest me greatly, she replied. Tell me, Doctor, what is your opinion? Could the poison have been absorbed through the skin? Quite possibly, if the concentration was sufficient and the exposure prolonged enough. Eutoxin can indeed be absorbed through contact, particularly if there were any small cuts or abrasions on the hands. And the symptoms? How rapidly would they appear? That would depend on the dose and the method of administration, but I should say within minutes rather than hours. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Then the poison was administered very shortly before Mr. Prowse collapsed, perhaps even as he stood to conduct the final hymn. That would be my assessment as well. She looked once more at the hymnal, at the deadly sprig pressed between its pages like a memorial to innocence lost. Someone knew a great deal about poisonous plants, she observed quietly, and someone planned this very carefully indeed. This was not an impulsive act, Doctor. This was murder most deliberate, carried out in the one place where people feel safest, and that, I think, makes it rather more wicked than most. Chapter 4 Whispers Among the Choir Boys. Christmas Day dawned cold and clear over St. Mary Mead, the snow lying thick and pristine across the village. It should have been a day of celebration and family gatherings, but the events of the previous night had cast a pall over the community. The church remained closed, its doors sealed by police order, and the Reverend Clement had been forced to cancel the morning service. Miss Marple rose early as was her custom, and after a simple breakfast set out for a constitutional walk. The cold air would clear her head, and there were certain observations she wished to make while her thoughts were still fresh. Her route took her past the vicarage, where she encountered Mrs. Clement in the garden, looking harried and distressed. "Miss Marple, how good of you to call. Leonard has been quite beside himself to think that murder should occur in our church, and on Christmas Eve. The bishop has been on the telephone already this morning, and Inspector Slack has been back twice. They've taken poor Mr. Prowse's body away for examination in London." "Most distressing for you both," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "I wonder, Mrs. Clement, have the choir boys been sent home? I imagine their parents must be deeply concerned." "They were released in the early hours, yes. Though Timothy Southers remained for some time, the inspector had additional questions for him, I believe. The poor boy looked quite shaken." "I'm sure he did. It cannot have been pleasant for any of them. Young minds are so impressionable, and to witness such a dreadful event." Miss Marple continued her walk, turning her steps toward the row of cottages where several of the choir boys lived. It was, she reflected, quite natural that she should wish to offer her condolences, and perhaps inquire after their well-being. After all, she had known most of these families for years. She found Timothy Southers at home, ostensibly helping his mother prepare vegetables for Christmas dinner, though in truth he appeared to be doing more staring than peeling. His mother, a thin, anxious woman who worked as a seamstress, greeted Miss Marple warmly. "How kind of you to call, Miss Marple. Timothy has been so upset, he's hardly slept." "Perfectly understandable," Miss Marple said gently. "Perhaps, if Timothy feels well enough, he might show me the garden. I noticed some particularly fine holly bushes when I passed earlier, and I should so like to see them more closely." Mrs. Southers agreed readily, and Timothy, with evident reluctance, led Miss Marple out to the small rear garden. Once they were alone, she turned to him with a kindly expression. "You've had a terrible shock, Timothy. I'm very sorry you had to witness such a thing." The boy's composure, already fragile, seemed to crumble. "It was horrible, Miss Marple. Mr. Prowse just fell. And before that there was the argument." "Argument?" Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, encouraging. Timothy bit his lip. "I shouldn't have said anything. Mother always says I talk too much. I'm sure your mother is quite right in general. But sometimes, Timothy, keeping stiltened about important matters can be more harmful than speaking. If you know something that might help explain what happened to Mr. Prowse, it would be very wrong not to tell." The boy looked at her with the transparent anxiety of youth. "It was before the service. I arrived early because I had to check the light switches. Mr. Prowse always made me test them beforehand to ensure they worked properly. I was in the vestry, and I heard voices from the choir room. Mr. Paworski and Prowse, and Mr. Leach. They were arguing." "Could you hear what they said?" "Not all of it. But Mr. Prowse was angry. He said something about accounts and dishonesty, and he said—" Timothy swallowed hard. He said, "After Christmas the truth comes out." Miss Marple absorbed this information with no visible reaction beyond a slight inclination of her head. "And Mr. Leach? What was his response?" "He sounded frightened. He said something like, 'You don't understand the situation,' and Mr. Prowse said he understood perfectly well. Then they stopped talking because someone else came in, Miss Hartwell, I think." "Did you mention this to Inspector Slack?" Timothy looked uncomfortable. "He asked if I'd heard anything unusual, but I didn't want to get Mr. Leach in trouble. He's always been decent to us boys, and Mr. Prowse could be harsh. I thought perhaps they had just been having a professional disagreement. But now you're not so certain. Now Mr. Prowse is dead, miss. And if what they're saying is true, if he was murdered, Then perhaps that argument matters after all. Miss Marple patted his arm reassuringly. You've done quite right to tell me, Timothy. I think you should share this with Inspector Slack as well, when you feel ready. It may be very important indeed. She left the Southers' cottage deep in thought and made her way to the home of young Peter Wickham, whose father kept the village greengrocer's shop. She found Peter and Robin Ashby, the smallest choir boy, playing rather listlessly in the Wickham's parlour under the watchful eye of Peter's elder sister. After exchanging pleasantries with the family, Miss Marple managed to engage the boys in conversation. They were initially reluctant to discuss the previous evening, but her gentle persistence gradually drew them out. Mr. Person's Prouse was different yesterday, Peter ventured. He wasn't as strict as usual during the warm-up. He let Robin get away with being flat on the second carol, and normally he'd have made him sing it again 6 times. He seemed distracted, Robin added. His eyes were still red from crying, and he kept looking at Mr. Leach with a funny expression, like he was angry but trying not to show it. Did either of you notice anything else unusual? Anything that seemed out of place? The boys exchanged glances. There was something, Peter said slowly. When we were lining up to process into the church, I saw Mr. Prouse drop something. A piece of paper, I think. It fell on the floor of the choir room, but he didn't pick it up. He just looked at it for a moment and then walked away. And the paper remained there? I don't know, miss. I had to go take my place in line. Miss Marple filed this information away. A dropped paper that Prouse had chosen not to retrieve. Interesting indeed. She spent another hour that morning visiting the families of the other choir boys and choir members, ostensibly offering Christmas wishes and sympathy. From each conversation she gleaned small fragments of information that, like pieces of a puzzle, began to form a larger picture. Miss Hartwell, when questioned delicately, admitted that she had indeed entered the choir room before the service and had found Mr. Prouse and Mr. Leach in what appeared to be a tense discussion. Both men had fallen silent immediately upon her entrance, and the atmosphere had been decidedly uncomfortable. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to miss an opportunity for drama, reported that she had heard rumours for months that Mr. Prouse intended to step down as choirmaster. There had been speculation about who might replace him, and the position came with a modest but respectable annual stipend from the church music fund. Mr. Huiyu and Mr. Leach naturally assumed he would be offered the position, Mrs. Price Ridley confided. After all, who else is there? But I heard that Mr. Prouse had been corresponding with someone in London, a professional choirmaster from one of the cathedral choirs. Leach must have known he would be passed over. By early afternoon, Miss Marple had returned to her cottage, where she found Mrs. Bantry waiting for her with barely contained impatience. "Jane, where have you been? I've been here this past half hour. You'll never guess what I've learned." "I suspect it concerns the church music fund," Miss Marple said, mildly, removing her hat and gloves. Mrs. Bantry deflated slightly. "Well, yes. How did you know?" "It seemed a reasonable assumption. Do tell me what you've discovered." "It's from Colonel Bantry, actually. He was speaking with Mr. Curl, the solicitor who sings in the choir, and it came out that there have been some irregularities in the church accounts. Nothing definite, you understand, but enough to raise questions. The music fund in particular has shown some rather peculiar expenditures over the past 2 years. And who manages the music fund?" "That's just it. Mr. Leach has been the treasurer for the music committee since he became organist. Mr. Prouse, as choirmaster, had oversight authority, but Leach handled the day-to-day finances." Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire. "That is most illuminating. Tell me, did Mr. Curl mention whether Mr. Prouse had raised any concerns about these irregularities?" "He did, apparently. About 3 weeks ago, Mr. Prouse came to Curl's office and requested copies of all the music fund transactions for the past 5 years. He said he wanted to review them before the annual church council meeting in January." The picture was becoming clearer. Alfred Prouse had discovered financial irregularities managed by Jonas Leach. He had been gathering evidence, preparing to expose the organist after Christmas. And Leach, facing public disgrace and likely criminal charges, had been desperate enough to commit murder, yet there were still pieces missing. The stranger in the dark coat, for instance. Who was he and what was his connection to this affair? And the matter of the broken carillon bell that Timothy had mentioned, the stuttering chimes that had signalled the dimming of the lights at precisely the wrong or perhaps the right moment. Miss Marple gazed into the fire, her mind working through the sequence of events. The switched hymnals, the poisoned yew, the blackened wax, the carefully timed darkness. It had been a methodical plan, executed with precision. But murders planned so carefully often contained their own undoing, for the very attention to detail that made them possible also created a trail of evidence for those who knew how to read it. "You're thinking," Mrs. Bantry observed. "I can always tell. You have that faraway look, as though you're seeing something no one else can see." "I'm thinking," Miss Marple said quietly, "about human nature and the terrible things people will do when they are cornered. I'm reminded of a case many years ago involving a church treasurer in Much Benham who embezzled funds to pay gambling debts. When he was discovered, he attempted to flee, but the guilt quite destroyed him. He confessed everything before he even reached the railway station." "Do you think Mr. Leach will confess?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that Mr. Leach is a frightened man who acted in desperation. But I also think there is more to this matter than we yet understand, and I suspect that before the truth is fully revealed, we shall discover that Christmas Eve held more secrets than one man's financial dishonesty." Chapter 5: The Broken Carillon Key. Boxing Day brought a thaw, and with it a steady drip of melting snow from the eaves of St. Mary Mead's cottages. Miss Marple, having attended early service at the chapel in the neighbouring village, the church of St. Mary Mead remaining firmly closed, returned home to find a note from the vicar requesting her presence at the vicarage at her earliest convenience. She found the Reverend Clement in his study, looking considerably more haggard than he had on Christmas morning. Inspector Slack was also present, his sharp features arranged in an expression of professional scepticism. "Miss Marple, the vicar, the inspector has been making inquiries, and certain matters have come to light that require, well, that is to say, your observations on Christmas Eve may prove valuable." Inspector Slack looked as though he would have preferred to conduct his investigation without the interference of elderly spinsters, but he had learned from previous cases that Miss Marple's insights, however irritating their source, were not to be dismissed lightly. "The doctor's examination has confirmed poisoning," he said brusquely. "Toxin absorbed through the skin. The concentration was high enough to cause death within minutes. We've established that the hymnal contained a pressed sprig of yew with the toxin concentrated on certain pages. What we need to determine is how the victim came into contact with it." "I believe I may be able to assist with that," Miss Marple said quietly. "The hymnal in question was not Mr. Prowse's own. It belonged to Mr. Leach's position at the organ." Slack's eyebrows rose. "You're certain of that? The music stands are marked with brass plates bearing the initials of their regular users. Mr. Prowse was conducting from Mr. Leach's stand when he collapsed. Then someone switched them." "So it would appear. During the dimming of the lights, I should imagine. In that moment of darkness, with everyone's attention focused forward, it would have been quite simple to exchange two identical hymnals." The inspector made a note. "I'll need to question Leach again. The man's been evasive from the start, won't meet my eyes, stammers when pressed on details." "If I might suggest," Miss Marple ventured, "there is another matter that may bear investigation. The carillon bell that signals the dimming of the lights, young Timothy Southers mentioned that it stuttered, that the chimes were not quite right. The vicar looked startled. The carillon? But surely that's simply a mechanical issue." "Perhaps. Yet the timing was rather convenient, was it not? The lights dimmed at precisely the moment required for the exchange to occur unnoticed." Inspector Slack rose abruptly. "The vestry, that's where the bell mechanism's housed. Show me." They made their way through the cold church, their footsteps echoing in the empty nave. The vestry was a small cluttered room lined with cupboards containing vestments, service, books, and various ecclesiastical paraphernalia. In one corner stood a small table on which rested the carillon mechanism, a beautifully crafted device of brass and wood with a series of keys corresponding to the church bells. Miss Marple approached it with interest. She had always admired the carillon, which had been installed some 30 years ago and was maintained with considerable care. Each key, when depressed, would activate a corresponding bell in the tower above, allowing the creation of simple melodies or the striking of individual chimes for various church functions. The vicar pointed to one particular key. This one controls the bell we use for the midnight service signal, 3 chimes to indicate the final hymn. Miss Marple bent to examine it more closely, and what she saw confirmed her suspicions. The key was broken, snapped cleanly in half. The break was fresh. There was no discoloration, no accumulation of dust or grime that would suggest an old fracture. "When did you last use this mechanism, Vicar?" "I tested all the bells myself on Christmas Eve afternoon, around 4 o'clock. Everything was functioning perfectly." "And this key was intact then?" "Absolutely. I'm quite certain of it." Inspector Slack produced a handkerchief and carefully lifted the broken piece that remained in the mechanism. "Deliberate, you think?" "I should say so," Miss Marple replied. "Observe how cleanly it is broken. Not the irregular fracture one would expect from age or accident, but a straight break, as though considerable force were applied at a weak point." "But why break it?" the vicar asked, bewildered. "What purpose could that serve?" Miss Marple considered. "I believe the purpose was twofold. First, to ensure the bell chimed irregularly, the stuttering that Timothy described. This would create a moment of confusion, of distraction, during which the murderer could act. Second, and perhaps more important, it allowed the murderer to control the precise timing. If the key were damaged, whoever operated it would need to strike it multiple times, creating a delay between attempts. And during that delay, the lights would be in the process of dimming, the congregation's attention would be uncertain, and someone moving in the choir stalls would be far less likely to be observed. Inspector Slack examined the broken key more closely. "Timothy Southers operates this mechanism. He said he had to strike it several times before it chimed properly." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but Timothy arrived early, you recall. He tested the switches as Mr. Prowse had instructed him to do. He would have been in the vestry well before the service began." "Long enough for someone else to damage the key after his preliminary tests?" "Quite long enough. The choir boys were in the choir room preparing their robes. The adult choir members were arriving and settling themselves. There would have been a considerable period when the vestry was unattended." The vicar wrung his hands. "This is dreadful. To think that someone moved about our church with such calculated malice, preparing to commit murder while we prepared to worship." Miss Marple's expression was grave. "Human nature, Vicar, remains constant whether in church or marketplace. The setting does not alter the capacity for evil. It merely makes it more shocking when that evil manifests." They returned to the vicar's study, where Inspector Slack sat heavily in a chair and consulted his notes. "Let me see if I have this straight," he said. "Someone broke the carillon key to control the timing of the light dimming. Someone placed a poisoned hymnal on Leach's music stand. Someone ensured that Prowse would conduct from that position and handle the contaminated pages. All of this required planning, access, and knowledge of the church routine." "It also required knowledge of poisonous plants," Miss Marple added. "Yew is not the sort of thing one simply stumbles upon. The toxin must be prepared carefully to achieve sufficient concentration. This was not an impulsive act." "Leach had motive," Slack said, ticking off points on his fingers. Prowse had discovered his financial irregularities and was preparing to expose him. Leach had opportunity. He was present throughout, had access to the vestry, knew the church routine intimately, and he certainly had the means. Any organist would be familiar with the mechanics of the carillon. "Yet there are complications," Miss Marple observed. "The stranger who attended the service and fled immediately afterward. The paper that Peter Wickham saw Mr. Prowse drop. and the argument that Timothy overheard, in which Mr. Prowse spoke of truth coming out after Christmas. You think there's more to this than simple embezzlement? I think, Inspector, that we have seen only the surface of this matter. Financial dishonesty may have been the motive, but the method speaks of something more complex. Someone went to considerable lengths to ensure that murder would occur at a specific time and in a specific manner. One might simply have poisoned a cup of tea and avoided all this elaborate staging. The vicar looked thoughtful. The midnight service is our most attended event of the year. Everyone in the village comes. Perhaps the murderer required witnesses. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said, the murderer required the confusion and distraction that such an event would provide. A murder in a crowded church with lights dimming and attention focused on the choir provides numerous opportunities for misdirection. Inspector Slack stood. I'm going to bring Leach in for formal questioning. The evidence is pointing directly at him, and I want answers about these financial irregularities. After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple remained for a few moments with the vicar. You're troubled, he observed. You're not entirely convinced of Mr. Leach's guilt? I'm convinced he is guilty of something, Miss Marple replied carefully. But whether that something is murder remains to be seen. There are elements here that don't quite fit the pattern of a desperate man acting to protect himself. The broken carillon key, for instance, that suggests someone with detailed knowledge of Timothy's routine, someone who understood precisely how the dimming of the lights would be controlled. Leach would have known that. Indeed, but so would anyone who had attended services regularly and paid attention. The routine has been the same for years. She rose to leave, her mind working through the accumulated evidence. The financial motive was clear enough, and Jonas Leach's behaviour had been suspicious from the outset. Yet there was something about the careful staging of the crime that suggested a mind more calculating than desperate, more methodical than panicked. As she walked home through the melting snow, Miss Marple found herself thinking of another case years ago, in which the obvious suspect had indeed proven guilty, but not in the way anyone had initially supposed. Sometimes, she reflected, the truth lay not in disproving the obvious, but in understanding the complexity beneath it. And sometimes the most important questions were not about who or how, but about why the murder had been committed in precisely the way it had. Chapter 6. A Stranger in the Last Pew. The day following Boxing Day brought Inspector Slack back to St. Mary Mead in a state of evident frustration. Miss Marple encountered him quite by accident, or perhaps not entirely by accident, at the Blue Boar, where she had stopped to inquire after the proprietor's ailing mother. Miss Marple, he said, his tone suggesting he was far from pleased to see her. I suppose you've heard that Leach has been questioned. I had heard something to that effect, Miss Marple replied mildly. Naturally, the village is much interested in the progress of your investigation. Progress, Slack said bitterly, is precisely what we lack. Leach admits to the financial irregularities, broke down completely and confessed he'd been taking money from the music fund for 2 years, gambling debts if you can credit it. Claims he meant to pay it all back, but he swears blind he didn't murder Prowse, and I can't prove otherwise. He has no alibi, I presume? He was at the organ the entire time. Says he never left his position, never touched Prowse's hymnal, never went near the vestry to damage the carillon key. And here's the thing, several people confirm he remained at the organ throughout. Mrs. Price Ridley swears she could see him from her position in the choir, and young Miss Hartwell says the same. Miss Marple considered this. Yet someone must have switched the hymnals during the dimming of the lights. That's what I told him, but he insists it wasn't him, and without witnesses to the actual switching, I can't prove it was. Slack lowered his voice. Between you and me, Miss Marple, I think the man's telling the truth about the murder at least. He's terrified enough about the embezzlement charges, facing criminal prosecution and complete disgrace. I don't think he's got the nerve to sit there lying about murder on top of it all. Then perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, we should turn our attention to the stranger who attended the service, the man in the dark coat who sat in the last pew. Slack's expression brightened slightly. I was going to ask if you remembered anything more about him. You spoke to him, didn't you? Very briefly, he was most anxious to leave, I thought, quite unwilling to engage in conversation. Description: a man of perhaps 40 years, lean build, dark hair, going slightly grey at the temples. Unremarkable features, the sort of face one might easily forget. His coat was of good quality, and he carried a leather folio. His manner suggested education and professional standing. And he gave no name? None, but I observed that his boots were very fine, London-made, I should say, and there was something about his bearing that suggested official capacity. Not a policeman, but perhaps someone accustomed to authority. Slack made notes. We've been making inquiries at the local inns. A man matching that description checked into the King's Arms on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, signed the register with initials only. T.H. said he was passing through and wished to attend the midnight service. How very interesting. Did he give any indication of his business in St. Mary Mead? The landlord says he asked directions to the church and inquired about the time of the service, stayed in his room until evening, then walked to St. Mary Mead, returned after midnight in considerable agitation, collected his things and left before dawn on Christmas morning. Paid his bill without comment. He fled, Miss Marple observed. That suggests either guilt or fear, or possibly both. That's what I thought. We've been trying to trace him, but T.H. isn't much to go on. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her mind working through possibilities. Inspector, you mentioned that Mr. Prowse had been gathering evidence about the financial irregularities, evidence he intended to present after Christmas. To whom would he have been presenting this evidence? To the church council, I assume, and possibly to the police, depending on what he'd discovered. But what if, Miss Marple said slowly, he had already reported his concerns to someone in authority, someone outside the village who might have come to investigate? Slack's eye sharpened. You think this T.H. was some sort of official investigator? It would explain his presence at the service, would it not? And his anxious departure after the murder. If he had come to meet with Mr. Prowse to receive evidence or testimony, then Prowse's death would have been most alarming indeed. He might well have felt it prudent to remove himself from the situation. Then why not identify himself? Why run? Fear of being implicated, perhaps. Or possibly he had reasons for maintaining anonymity. If he were conducting a confidential investigation, he might not wish to reveal himself publicly. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook again. There's something else. We found a letter in Prowse's pocket, unposted, addressed to someone at the diocesan offices in London. In it, he requests an urgent meeting to discuss serious irregularities in the church music fund, requiring immediate attention. The letter is dated December 20th, 5 days before his death. Exactly. And it was never sent. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. How very curious. Why would he draft such a letter and then fail to post it? Perhaps he changed his mind, or perhaps he made contact through other means, a telephone call, another letter we haven't found. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, he had already made his report, and this was merely a formality he decided was unnecessary. If T.H. is indeed connected to the diocese, it's possible he came in response to an earlier communication. They were interrupted by the arrival of young Miss Hartwell, who had evidently been searching for the inspector. Her face was flushed with cold and excitement. Inspector Slack! Oh, and Miss Marple, how fortunate! I've remembered something that might be important. Go on, Miss Hartwell. She twisted her gloves in her hands. It's about the stranger you've been asking about, the man in the dark coat. I saw him before the service, you see, around 11:30 when I was arriving at the church. He was standing in the churchyard, near the old yew tree by the wall. He seemed to be watching the church entrance. Watching for someone? Miss Marple asked gently. I think so. He had that look. You know, the way people do when they're waiting for a particular person to arrive. And when Mr. Prowse came hurrying up the path a few minutes later, the stranger stepped forward as though to speak to him. But then Mr. Prowse went straight into the church without noticing him, and the stranger seemed to hesitate. He stood there for several minutes more, and then he followed Mr. Prowse inside. "Did he approach Mr. Prowse at any point during the service?" Slack demanded. "Not that I saw. He took a seat in the last pew and remained there throughout, but he was definitely watching Mr. Prowse. I noticed because it seemed odd. Such intense attention from a stranger." After Miss Hartwell had departed, promising to provide a written statement, Inspector Slack turned to Miss Marple with renewed energy. "This puts a different complexion on things. If this TH came specifically to meet with Prowse, and Prowse died before they could speak privately, then someone may have murdered Mr. Prowse to prevent that meeting from taking place," Miss Marple finished quietly. "Which suggests the motive was not merely to silence Mr. Prowse about what he had already discovered, but to prevent him from sharing that information with someone who had the authority to act upon it. Jonas Leach knew Prowse had evidence against him. If he also knew that an official investigator was coming, then he had mere hours to act," Miss Marple agreed. Christmas Eve would have been his last opportunity to prevent the exposure. After that meeting, his crimes would have been revealed to diocesan authorities, and there would have been no escape. Slack stood abruptly. "I need to question Leach again. If he knew about this TH, if he knew Prowse was meeting with an investigator, I think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that you might also wish to trace TH himself. If he came at the diocese's behest, they will have a record of his identity and his assignment, and I suspect his testimony might prove most illuminating as to Mr. Prowse's state of mind and intentions in those final hours." As Inspector Slack strode away with renewed purpose, Miss Marple remained at the Blue Boar for a few moments longer, considering what they had learned. The picture was becoming clearer, yet certain elements still troubled her. If Jonas Leach had indeed murdered Alfred Prowse to prevent his exposure, it was a desperate gamble that seemed strangely elaborate for a man of Leach's nervous temperament. The broken carillon key, the poisoned hymnal, the careful timing all suggested a mind capable of maintaining composure under extraordinary pressure. Yet Leach had broken down completely when questioned about the embezzlement. His fear and guilt had been transparently obvious. Could such a man have carried out so calculated a murder without betraying himself? Miss Marple thought once again of the stranger TH watching from the churchyard, waiting for a meeting that would never occur, and fleeing into the night when murder intervened. What, she wondered, had he seen, and why had he not come forward? The answers, she suspected, lay not in St. Mary Mead, but in London, in the diocesan offices where Alfred Prowse had made his fateful report. Chapter 7, The Gift Left on the Altar. Christmas morning services had been held in the neighbouring parish, but by the following day, the Church of St. Mary Mead was reopened for private prayer, though the choir stalls and vestry remained sealed by police order. It was on this day, the 27th of December, that the Reverend Clement discovered something that would prove most significant to the investigation. Miss Marple learned of it when Mrs. Clement appeared at her cottage shortly after breakfast, breathless and agitated. "Miss Marple, the most extraordinary thing has happened. Leonard found a parcel on the altar this morning, a wrapped gift that wasn't there yesterday. Someone has been in the church overnight, and Leonard is quite beside himself. Inspector Slack has been sent for, but I thought you should know at once." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with measured calm. "A parcel on the altar? How very irregular. The church was locked, I presume?" "Yes, firmly locked. Leonard checked all the doors himself last evening. Yet this morning there it was, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, sitting in the centre of the altar as bold as you please." Within the quarter hour, Miss Marple had accompanied Mrs. Clement to the church, where they found the vicar standing before the altar with an expression of profound distress. The parcel lay where he had discovered it, untouched pending the inspector's arrival. "It's a violation," the Reverend Clement said quietly, "not merely of the church's security, but of the sacred space itself. The altar is consecrated ground. To place such an object there, after what has occurred—" He fell silent as Inspector Slack arrived, accompanied by Constable Polk. The inspector's face was grim as he surveyed the scene. "No one is to touch anything until I have examined it," he announced. He approached the altar carefully, studying the parcel from various angles. It was perhaps 8 inches square, neatly wrapped, with no visible markings or address. "Vicar, you're certain the church was secured last evening?" "Absolutely certain. I locked both the main doors and the vestry entrance myself. I checked each lock twice." "Then whoever left this had a key, or knew how to pick a lock." Slack produced a pocket knife and carefully cut the string, then unfolded the brown paper wrapping with meticulous care. Inside was a small wooden box, unadorned save for a brass clasp. The inspector lifted it gingerly and opened the lid. Miss Marple, positioned so that she had a clear view, observed the contents with considerable interest. The box contained what appeared to be a silver case, approximately 4 inches in length, engraved with elaborate scrollwork. On the lid, clearly visible, were the initials AP. "Alfred Prowse," the vicar breathed. "That's his. I've seen him carry it. He kept his reading spectacles in it." Inspector Slack lifted the silver case from the box and opened it. The spectacles were gone. In their place lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and covered in neat columns of figures and notations. "It's a ledger page," Slack said, smoothing it carefully on the altar cloth. "Or part of one. Look here, entries going back 2 years. Music fund, external consultant, multiple payments, each one substantial." Miss Marple moved closer, her eyes scanning the entries with practiced efficiency. The amounts vary, but they follow a pattern. Monthly payments, never quite the same sum, but always within a similar range. Someone was attempting to disguise the regularity of the withdrawals. "And here," the vicar said, pointing with a trembling finger, "the notations. J.L. beside each entry, Jonas Leach." But Miss Marple had noticed something else. "Inspector, observe the notation at the bottom. It's in different ink, added later. It says, 'External consultant. Verify identity. Query, does this person exist?'" The implication was clear. Someone, presumably Alfred Prowse, had begun to suspect that the so-called external consultant was fictitious, that Jonas Leach had been creating false entries to justify the withdrawal of funds. "This is evidence," Slack said grimly. "This is what Prowse had on Leach. But why leave it here now in this manner?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "whoever left it wishes us to understand the motive for murder. Or perhaps they wish to direct our attention to Mr. Leach's guilt." "Or away from their own," Slack countered. He examined the box again, then the wrapping paper. "No fingerprints visible, though we'll test properly. Professional job, this, someone who knew what they were doing." The vicar sank into a nearby pew, his face pale. "This means Jonas Leach truly did commit murder. The evidence of his theft, the proof that Prowse had discovered his crimes, it all points to desperate action to prevent exposure." "Yet there are curiosities," Miss Marple observed. She had moved to examine the altar more closely, her sharp eyes noting every detail. "This silver case belonged to Mr. Prowse, you say? Where has it been since his death?" "His personal effects were collected and given to his sister in London," the vicar replied. "She came the day after Christmas to make arrangements. I helped her gather his things from the choir room and the vestry. So this case should now be in London, in the possession of Mr. Prowse's sister, and here it is, returned to St. Mary Mead and placed on the altar in a locked church. Most peculiar indeed." Inspector Slack was frowning. "You think the sister brought it back?" "I think it highly unlikely. A bereaved woman who has just collected her brother's effects would hardly return one item in such a theatrical manner. No, Inspector, I believe this case never left St. Mary Mead at all." "Then Prowse's sister didn't take it?" "Perhaps it was not among his effects when she collected them. Perhaps someone had removed it before then, knowing it contained evidence." The inspector's expression grew sharp. "Leach? If he knew Prowse kept this ledger page in his spectacle case, then he might have taken it immediately after the murder, hoping to destroy the evidence against him. But if so, why return it now? Why draw attention to his motive when he has already denied any involvement in the murder?" They stood in silence for a moment. considering the implications. The church was very quiet, with only the faint sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves. Miss Marple moved slowly around the altar, examining it from all angles. "Inspector, when did you last inspect the altar area?" "Yesterday afternoon, when we reopened the church for prayer. There was nothing here then." "And the vicar locked the church at what time yesterday evening?" "Just after 6 o'clock, the Reverend Clement confirmed. I made my rounds, checked the doors, and departed." "So between 6 o'clock last evening and this morning, someone entered a locked church and placed this parcel here? Someone with a key or someone with the skill to pick locks? Someone who wished us to find this evidence but did not wish to present it openly?" "Why not simply give it to the police?" Slack demanded. "Why this elaborate staging?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "because the person who left it cannot risk being identified. Or perhaps because they wish to maintain distance from the investigation while still ensuring that justice is served." She thought of the stranger, T.H., who had fled into the night. A man with official connections, possibly. A man who might have access to information about the case, who might have his own reasons for wishing to see the truth revealed without personally involving himself. "There's another possibility," she continued. "What if this evidence was not in Mr. Leach's possession at all? What if someone else removed it from Mr. Prowse's effects, someone who understood its significance? Who else would have had access? Anyone who entered the choir room or vestry after the murder, but before Mr. Prowse's sister arrived to collect his things. The church was not continuously guarded. There were hours when someone might have searched his belongings." Inspector Slack made rapid notes. "I'll need to interview everyone who had access to the church after the murder. And I'll need to speak with Prowse's sister, find out exactly what she collected and whether she noticed anything missing." As the inspector departed to make his inquiries, Miss Marple remained in the church, her eyes moving from the altar to the choir stalls, from the vestry door to the main entrance. Someone had walked through this space in darkness, carrying evidence of embezzlement and murder, and had placed it deliberately where it would be discovered. The theatrical nature of the gesture troubled her. It suggested either great confidence or great desperation, and the timing, waiting several days after the murder to produce this evidence, implied calculation rather than impulse. She thought again of the silver case with its engraved initials. Alfred Prowse had carried it regularly, had kept his spectacles in it. Yet he had also used it apparently to conceal the damning ledger page. He had known the evidence was dangerous, had known that Jonas Leach would be desperate to destroy it. Had Prowse told anyone else about this evidence? Had he mentioned it to the mysterious T.H. during their intended meeting? Or had someone else, someone they had not yet identified, known about it all along? Miss Marple walked slowly to the last pew, where the stranger had sat during the midnight service. She lowered herself onto the worn wood and looked forward toward the altar, imagining what he must have seen. From this vantage point, one could observe the entire church, the choir stalls, the congregation, the movements of everyone present. The perfect position for someone who wished to watch without being observed. The perfect position for someone who had come seeking truth and had witnessed murder instead. She rose and made her way toward home, her mind working through the accumulated evidence. The case against Jonas Leach appeared overwhelming. Motive, opportunity, and now physical evidence linking him to embezzlement. Yet the manner of its presentation suggested complexities they had not yet fully understood. And somewhere in London, a stranger with the initials T.H. knew more than he had yet revealed. The question was whether he would come forward, or whether Miss Marple would need to find him first. Chapter 8. The Choir Boy's Secret. The following morning brought a development that Miss Marple had rather been expecting. Young Timothy Southers appeared at her cottage door, his face pale and his manner suggesting a burden of conscience that had finally become too heavy to bear. "Miss Marple," he said, twisting his cap in his hands, "might I speak with you? It's about what happened on Christmas Eve. I've been thinking about it ever since, and I don't know what to do." Miss Marple ushered him into her sitting room and provided him with tea and biscuits, understanding that young people often found confession easier when their hands were occupied with mundane tasks. "You've remembered something else," she said gently, once he was settled. "Something that has been troubling you." Timothy nodded miserably. "I should have told Inspector Slack straight away, but I was frightened. Not for myself, but, well, it seemed like it might get someone in terrible trouble and I wasn't certain what it meant." "The best thing," Miss Marple said, "is simply to tell the truth as you observed it. Let others determine what it means." The boy took a deep breath. "It was before the service, when I was in the vestry checking the light switches as Mr. Prowse had instructed. I finished early and I was just standing there, looking at the carillon, because I've always thought it was rather fine. And then I heard voices from the choir room, Mr. Prowse and Mr. Leach, arguing, as I mentioned before." "Yes, you told me about that conversation. But there was more. After they stopped arguing, after Miss Hartwell came in and they went quiet, I stayed in the vestry because I didn't want them to know I'd been listening. And I saw Mr. Leach come out of the choir room and go to the cupboard where we keep the spare vestments. He looked around, very quickly, as though checking no one was watching, but I was partly hidden by the door, and he didn't see me." Timothy paused, his hands gripping his teacup tightly. He took something from his pocket, something small, wrapped in cloth, and he put it into Mr. Prowse's coat pocket. Mr. Prowse's coat was hanging on the peg there, where he always left it before the service. Mr. Leach was very careful about it, very quick, and then he left." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her mind worked rapidly. "Did you see what the object was?" "No, miss. It was wrapped in dark cloth, about the size of, well, perhaps a spectacle case, or a small box." "And what did you do then?" Timothy's face reddened. "I should have said something immediately, but I was confused, and the service was about to begin, and I thought perhaps it was something innocent. Perhaps Mr. Leach was returning something that belonged to Mr. Prowse, so I went to take my position with the other choir boys." "But that's not all, is it?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "No." Timothy set down his teacup. "After Mr. Prowse collapsed, after all the confusion and Dr. Haydock was attending to him, I saw Mr. Leach go to the vestry. Everyone was distracted, you see, gathered around Mr. Prowse, but I noticed because I was standing near the back of the choir stalls, and I saw Mr. Leach slip away. He was only gone for a moment, perhaps 30 seconds. When he came back, his face was white as chalk and his hands were shaking." "Did you see what he did in the vestry?" "No, miss, but I think he must have gone to Mr. Prowse's coat, because when the police were questioning everyone and going through Mr. Prowse's effects, they didn't find anything unusual in his pockets. At least they didn't mention anything." Miss Marple considered this carefully. So Jonas Leach had placed something in Prowse's coat pocket before the service and then retrieved it immediately after the murder. The silver spectacle case, perhaps? The one that had mysteriously appeared on the altar containing the incriminating ledger page? "Timothy," she said, "there's something else troubling you. I can see it in your face." The boy's composure finally crumbled. "It's about the note, miss, the one I found." "What note is this?" "It was during the service, before Mr. Prowse collapsed. During the second carol, I saw something white fall from Mr. Prowse's hand. He was holding his music folder, and this paper just fluttered down into the choir stalls. It landed near my feet, and I picked it up without thinking. I shouldn't have kept it, but everything happened so quickly after that, and then I was frightened about what it might mean." He reached into his pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, creased and slightly crumpled. "I've been carrying it about, not knowing what to do, but after seeing you at the church, after hearing you talk to Inspector Slack, I thought you might know what it means." Miss Marple took the note and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, written in pencil on a torn scrap of paper that appeared to have come from a notebook. The message was brief. "He knows about the fund. Midnight. Decide." There was no signature, no indication of who had written it or to whom it was addressed, but the implication was clear enough. Someone had sent this note to Alfred Prowse, warning him that his investigation into the music fund had been discovered, and the reference to midnight suggested that Christmas Eve had been designated as the moment of decision. "When did you find this?" Miss Marple asked. "During the service, as I said. It fell from Mr. Prowse's folder just minutes before he collapsed. He must have been holding it, perhaps reading it when it happened." "And you haven't shown this to anyone else?" Timothy shook his head. "I was afraid. If it's from Mr. Leach, if it's evidence that he knew Mr. Prowse was going to expose him, then it makes him guilty of murder, doesn't it? And I keep thinking about how he was kind to me sometimes, how he helped me with my piano scales when I was struggling. It doesn't seem right that someone who could be kind like that could also be a murderer." Miss Marple's expression was compassionate but firm. "Human nature is rarely simple, Timothy. Good people can do wicked things when they are desperate, and wicked people can show moments of kindness. It's one of the great difficulties of understanding our fellow creatures." She studied the note again, her mind working through its implications. The handwriting was educated but hurried, suggesting someone writing under stress. The phrasing was careful. He knows, rather than using Prowse's name directly, the fund rather than specifying which fund. It was written by someone attempting to maintain deniability, even while issuing what amounted to a threat. "Timothy," she said, "you must take this to Inspector Slack immediately. This is important evidence, and withholding it could be considered obstruction of justice. I know you're worried about the implications, but the truth must come out, whatever it may be." "Will you come with me, miss? I'd feel better if you were there to explain." "Of course, we'll go together right now." They found Inspector Slack at the vicarage, where he had been conducting further interviews. His expression when he saw the note was a mixture of triumph and exasperation. "This changes everything, he declared after Timothy had given his full account. "This proves Leach knew Prowse was on to him. Midnight. Decide." He was giving Prowse an ultimatum, or perhaps warning him of the consequences if he proceeded with the exposure. Or, Miss Marple suggested quietly, someone was warning Mr. Prowse that a decision would be made at midnight, not necessarily by the sender of the note, but by someone else. Slack frowned. "You're splitting hairs, Miss Marple. The meaning is clear enough. Leach knew he was discovered, and he took action to prevent his exposure. Perhaps, but consider the sequence of events as Timothy has described them. Mr. Leach placed something in Mr. Prowse's coat pocket before the service, something he then retrieved immediately after the murder. Why would he do that if he were planning to kill Prowse? Why risk placing evidence near the victim's person? Maybe he was trying to plant false evidence to implicate someone else. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said, he was attempting to return something, the silver spectacle case for instance, which we know contained the incriminating ledger page. If Mr. Leach had taken it earlier, hoping to destroy the evidence, he might have been attempting to return it before Prowse noticed it was missing. Timothy spoke up hesitantly. Mr. Burns Leach did seem nervous when he was putting it in the coat pocket, not sneaky exactly, but more like he was doing something he wasn't supposed to do but felt he had to. Inspector Slack made extensive notes, his expression sceptical but thoughtful. I'll need to question Leach again about this. If he was in possession of Prowse's spectacle case before the service, that's highly significant. After the interview concluded and Timothy had been sent home with stern instructions to come forward immediately if he remembered anything else, Miss Marple remained for a moment with the inspector. "The note troubles me," she said. "The phrasing suggests it was written by someone with knowledge of the investigation, but also someone who was not directly involved. An observer, perhaps, rather than a participant." "You think someone else knew about the embezzlement?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that there may have been more people aware of Mr. Prowse's investigation than we have yet identified. And I think the stranger with the leather folio, the man who signed himself T.H., may be rather more central to this matter than we have supposed." She thought of the note's warning. Midnight. Decide. It had the quality of an ultimatum, yes, but also of a schedule, as though events had been set in motion that would culminate at a specific time, and someone had felt compelled to warn Alfred of Prowse of what was coming. The question was whether the warning had come from a friend or an enemy, and whether its purpose had been to save Prowse's life or to ensure he would be in exactly the right place when murder struck. Chapter 9. The Letter in the Organ Bench. Inspector Slack's renewed interrogation of Jonas Leach proved fruitless. The organist, now thoroughly broken by the revelation of his embezzlement and facing criminal charges, insisted with desperate consistency that while he had indeed stolen from the music fund, he had not murdered Alfred Prowse. He admitted to taking the silver spectacle case from Prowse's belongings the morning after the murder, hoping to destroy the ledger page before it could be discovered. But he swore he had not placed it on the altar, and he could not explain how it had gotten there. "Someone is trying to frame me," he repeated, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The embezzlement is bad enough, I don't deny that, but I'm not a murderer. I couldn't have done it. I was at the organ the entire time." Miss Marple, learning of this interview from Mrs. Bantry, who had heard it from Colonel Bantry, who had spoken with Inspector Slack at the tobacco shop, found herself increasingly convinced that Jonas Leach was telling the truth about the murder, if not about his other crimes. "The pieces don't fit quite right," she confided to Mrs. Bantry over afternoon tea. Mr. Leach is guilty of theft, certainly, and guilty of attempting to conceal evidence after the fact. But the murder itself required a steadiness of nerve and a capacity for calculation that seems quite at odds with his behaviour since. Perhaps desperation made him capable of things he wouldn't normally do, Mrs. Bantry suggested. Perhaps. Yet consider the method, the poisoned hymnal, the broken carillon key, the precise timing required. All of this suggests someone who could maintain composure under extraordinary pressure. Mr. Leach has maintained no composure whatsoever. He broke down the moment he was seriously questioned. "Then who did kill Mr. Prowse?" "That," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "is what we have yet to discover, though I suspect the answer lies not in St. Mary Mead, but in London." It was this conviction that led her, the following morning, to pay a visit to the church. The building was now open for general use again, though the vestry remained partially restricted. Miss Marple informed the vicar that she wished to spend some time in quiet reflection and prayer, which was perfectly true, though not the whole truth. Once alone in the church, she made her way to the organ. It was a handsome instrument, installed some 40 years ago and maintained with considerable care. The organ bench was a substantial piece of furniture with a hinged lid that opened to reveal storage for music and various sundries. Miss Marple lifted the lid and peered inside. The space was neatly organised, with sheet music arranged in careful stacks, a bottle of valve oil, several spare reeds, and a cloth-bound book that appeared to be a maintenance log. She removed the items carefully, examining each one, and it was when she lifted the maintenance log that she discovered what she had been seeking. Beneath the book, pressed flat against the bottom of the bench, lay an envelope. It was unsealed, and inside was a letter written in Alfred Prowse's distinctive hand. The paper was of good quality, and the writing was firm and clear, suggesting it had been composed with care rather than in haste. Miss Marple carried the letter to the window, where the light was better, and read, "My dear Hargreaves, by the time you read this, we shall have spoken at last, and you will understand the full extent of the irregularities I have uncovered. I write this as a precaution, in case something should prevent our meeting, or in case I am unable to communicate clearly when the moment comes. The evidence is clear. Jonas Leach has been systematically embezzling from the church music fund for at least 2 years, possibly longer. The attached ledger page, which I keep in my spectacle case, shows the pattern of false entries he created to disguise his theft. He invented a fictional external consultant and made regular payments to this non-existent person, pocketing the money himself. I discovered the fraud quite by accident 3 weeks ago, while reviewing accounts in preparation for the annual church council meeting. My initial instinct was to confront Leach privately, to give him the opportunity to confess and make restitution. But when I approached him, his reaction alarmed me. He became agitated, almost threatening, and made it clear he would do anything to prevent exposure. It was then I decided to contact the diocesan authorities. I could not trust that Leach would act honourably, and I feared he might attempt to destroy evidence or implicate others. You have assured me that you will come on Christmas Eve to receive my full report, and I'm grateful for your discretion in this matter. However, I must confess to feeling uneasy. Leach has been watching me with increasing anxiety these past few days. I believe he suspects I have reported him. The note I received this morning, unsigned but clearly from someone with knowledge of the situation, warned that a decision would be made at midnight. I do not know what this means, but I find it troubling. If anything should happen to me before we can meet, please ensure this letter reaches the proper authorities. The evidence is substantial, and justice must be served. I remain, with all good wishes for this holy season, Alfred Prowse. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her mind absorbing every detail and implication. So T.H. was indeed Hargreaves, sent by the diocese to investigate. Alfred Prowse had arranged to meet him during the midnight service, presumably in some quiet moment when they might speak privately. But the meeting had never occurred, because Prowse had been murdered before it could take place. The letter explained much, but it also raised new questions. Prowse had mentioned receiving a note warning him of a decision at midnight. The same note Timothy had found. Who had sent it? Not Leach. Surely who would have had no reason to warn Prowse of danger? Someone else, then, who knew about the embezzlement, knew about Hargreaves's visit, and knew that Christmas Eve would be the moment of crisis. But who else had known? Prowse had been discreet in his investigation. He had confided in Hargreaves and in no one else, according to the letter. Yet someone had known enough to send that warning. Miss Marple carefully replaced all the items in the organ bench except the letter, which she folded and placed in her handbag. She would need to take this to Inspector Slack immediately. But first, she wanted to verify one more detail. She made her way to the vestry and examined the cupboard, where the vestments were kept. The coat hooks were arranged along one wall, each labelled with a small brass tag indicating whose coat should hang there. Mr. Prowse's hook was positioned near the door, easily accessible to anyone entering the vestry. It would have been simple for Jonas Leach to slip something into Prowse's coat pocket without being observed. Simple, too, for him to retrieve it later in the confusion following the murder. But why had Leach taken the spectacle case in the first place? If he had known it contained evidence against him, why not destroy it immediately? Why keep it for days before placing it on the altar? Unless, Miss Marple thought, he had not placed it on the altar at all. Unless someone else had taken it from him, or found it, and decided to use it to direct attention toward Leach's guilt. She returned to the nave and stood for a moment, looking at the last pew where Hargreaves had sat. From that position, he would have seen everything, the dimming of the lights, the confusion in the choir stalls, the collapse of Alfred Prowse. He would have realised immediately that the man he had come to meet was dying, that the evidence he had come to collect would never be delivered, and he had fled, taking with him whatever knowledge he possessed, but refusing to come forward as a witness. Why? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay in the nature of his mission. Diocesan investigators worked confidentially. Their identities and activities kept secret to prevent interference with their inquiries. If Hargreaves had revealed himself publicly as a witness to the murder, his effectiveness in future investigations would be compromised. His superiors might well have instructed him to remain silent, to allow the local police to conduct their investigation without his involvement. But he had not remained entirely silent, had he? Someone had left that silver case on the altar. Someone had ensured the evidence would be discovered, and Miss Marple was increasingly certain that someone was Thomas Hargreaves. She made her way to the vicarage and requested an audience with the Reverend Clement and Inspector Slack. When they were assembled in the vicar's study, she produced the letter. "I believe," she said, "that this will clarify several matters. I found it hidden in the organ bench, where Mr. Prowse appears to have left it as a safeguard against exactly what transpired." Inspector Slack read the letter with growing interest, his expression transforming from scepticism to excitement. "This identifies our T.H. Thomas Hargreaves, diocesan investigator, and it confirms that Prowse was planning to meet with him on Christmas Eve. It also confirms, Miss Marple added, that Mr. Prowse was afraid. He sensed danger, though he may not have fully understood its nature or source. But it still points to Leach, Slack insisted. Prowse says Leach became threatening when confronted. Leach had the strongest motive to prevent exposure. Yet Mr. Prowse also mentions the mysterious note warning of a decision at midnight. That note did not come from Mr. Leach, I think. It came from someone else, someone who knew about the embezzlement, knew about Mr. Hargreaves's visit, and felt compelled to warn Mr. Prowse. The vicar looked troubled. So who else could have known? Alfred was discreet. He would not have gossiped about such serious matters. No, Miss Marple agreed, but information has a way of becoming known nonetheless. A letter seen by chance, a telephone conversation overheard. A pattern of behaviour that reveals itself to the observant eye. Someone knew, Vicar, and I think that someone may have been trying to prevent murder rather than commit it. She thought again of Hargreaves sitting alone in that last pew, watching and waiting. What had he seen in those final moments before the lights dimmed? What had he witnessed that had sent him fleeing into the night? The answer to that question, Miss Marple was certain, would solve the mystery of who had killed Alfred Prowse, and she suspected that Thomas Hargreaves, wherever he was, knew it too. Chapter 10. The Silent Night Revealed. Inspector Slack's telegram to the diocesan offices in London brought results more swiftly than anyone had anticipated. By the following afternoon, Thomas Hargreaves arrived in St. Mary Mead, his manner suggesting a man who had reconciled himself to an unwelcome duty. He was precisely as Miss Marple had remembered him, lean, dark-haired, with unremarkable features and an air of quiet authority. Inspector Slack received him in the vicar's study, and after some initial reluctance agreed to Miss Marple's presence at the interview. Mr. Hargreaves, Slack began, I must ask you to explain your presence at St. Mary Mead on Christmas Eve, and your subsequent departure without making yourself known to the authorities. Hargreaves settled into his chair with evident weariness. I am a diocesan investigator, as you have no doubt discovered. I was sent to meet with Alfred Prowse regarding serious allegations of financial irregularity in the church music fund. Mr. Prowse had contacted us 3 weeks prior with detailed evidence of systematic embezzlement by the church organist, Jonas Leach. Why did you not come forward as a witness to the murder? Because I witnessed nothing that would identify the murderer. I arrived at the church shortly before the service began and took a position in the last pew, as Mr. Prowse had suggested in his correspondence. We had agreed to meet privately after the service concluded. I was merely to observe during the service itself, to verify certain details about the church's operations. And what did you observe? Hargreaves's expression was grim. I saw Alfred Prowse die. I saw him collapse during what should have been a moment of reverence and beauty, and I realized immediately that his death was no accident, that someone had murdered him to prevent our meeting. Yet you fled. I made a professional judgment that proved perhaps to be an error. My superiors and I concluded that my presence would complicate the investigation without materially assisting it. I had no evidence to offer regarding the actual murder. I had seen nothing definitive during the service itself. Miss Marple spoke quietly. But you returned, Mr. Hargreaves. You left the silver spectacle case on the altar, did you not? Hargreaves met her gaze directly. I did. After learning that Leach had confessed to the embezzlement but denied the murder, I felt compelled to ensure the evidence reached the proper authorities. I retrieved the case from where I had found it, and placed it where it would be discovered. Where had you found it? Inspector Slack demanded. In the churchyard, the morning after the murder. I had returned to look for something I thought I might have dropped during my hasty departure. Instead, I found the case lying in the snow near the old yew tree. It must have fallen from someone's pocket or been discarded there. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. The yew tree? How very interesting. Tell me, Mr. Hargreaves, when you were sitting in that last pew during the service, What precisely did you see when the lights were dimmed?" Hargreaves paused, his expression thoughtful. "Very little, I'm afraid. The darkness was quite profound, with only the candles remaining lit. I could see the general movement of the choir and congregation, but no specific details. I was watching Mr. Prowse, of course, waiting for the service to conclude so we might speak. When he collapsed, my attention naturally focused entirely on him." "You saw no one approach him? No one near the choir stalls during that crucial moment?" "I saw movement, but I could not identify individuals. The candlelight created shadows, and everyone was standing for the hymn." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She had suspected as much. The murderer had planned carefully, using the dimmed lights not merely to conceal their actions from the congregation, but to ensure that even a trained observer like Hargreaves would see nothing conclusive. "Inspector," she said, "I believe it is time to gather everyone together. I think I can explain what happened on Christmas Eve, though I confess the truth is rather more complex than it first appeared." Slack looked sceptical, but after a moment's consideration he nodded. "Very well, Miss Marple. Though I warn you, if this is one of your theatrical reconstructions, I assure you, Inspector, I have no taste for theatre. I merely wish to present the facts as I understand them, and allow you to draw the appropriate conclusions." Within the hour they had assembled in the church vestry. Inspector Slack, Constable Polk, the Reverend Clement, Jonas Leach looking haggard and desperate, Thomas Hargreaves maintaining his professional composure, and the key witnesses including Timothy Sothers, Miss Hartwell and Mrs. Price Ridley. Miss Marple stood before them, her slight figure somehow commanding attention despite her unassuming manner. "The murder of Alfred Prowse," she began, "appeared at first to be a straightforward case. Mr. Leach had been embezzling from the church music fund. Mr. Prowse discovered this and prepared to expose him. Mr. Leach, facing disgrace and criminal prosecution, murdered him to prevent that exposure. The method was elaborate but logical, a poisoned hymnal, carefully timed to coincide with the dimming of lights during the midnight service." She paused, allowing her words to settle. But as I examined the evidence more carefully, certain inconsistencies emerged. Mr. Leach, we are told, placed something in Mr. Prowse's coat pocket before the service and retrieved it immediately afterward. If he were planning murder, why risk placing evidence near the victim? The answer, I believe, is that he was not planning murder at all. He was attempting to return the silver spectacle case he had stolen earlier. Jonas Leach's head jerked up, his eyes wide. "Yes! That's exactly what I was doing. I had taken it the day before, hoping to destroy the ledger page, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not completely. So I thought if I returned it before Alfred noticed it was missing, perhaps I could convince him to give me time to make restitution." "But the case never reached Mr. Prowse's pocket, did it?" Miss Marple continued. "Because someone else intercepted it. Someone who realised it contained valuable evidence and removed it before the murder occurred." "Who?" Inspector Slack demanded. "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mr. Prowse himself discovered the case had been returned to his coat. He retrieved it during the service and brought it with him to the choir stalls, intending perhaps to show it to Mr. Hargreaves as proof of the embezzlement. But in the confusion following his collapse, the case fell from his pocket and was either taken by someone in the crowd or dropped in the churchyard." She turned to Timothy. "You mentioned that Mr. Prowse dropped something during the service, a piece of paper that fell into the choir stalls. I believe he may have dropped other items as well, in those final moments when the poison was taking effect." "But who poisoned him?" the vicar asked desperately. "If not Mr. Leach, then who?" Miss Marple's expression was sorrowful. "That is where I must confess the limits of my knowledge. I know the method, the U pressed in the hymnal, the toxin concentrated on pages that Mr. Prowse would touch. I know the timing during the dimming of lights when movement would go unnoticed. I know the hymnals were switched, placing the poisoned book where Mr. Prowse would use it." She looked at each face in turn. "But I cannot prove who accomplished this switch. The darkness was too complete, the confusion too general. Anyone in the choir or near the choir stalls could have made the exchange." "Then we're no further forward," Slack said with frustration. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied. We know something very important. Mr. Leach did not commit this murder. He is guilty of theft, certainly, and guilty of attempting to conceal evidence. But he lacked the nerve and the calculation required for so elaborate a crime. The real murderer is someone else entirely, someone who knew about the embezzlement, who knew about Mr. Hargreaves's visit, and who saw an opportunity to eliminate Mr. Prowse while ensuring suspicion fell elsewhere. She paused, and in that pause, understanding seemed to dawn in several faces simultaneously. The note, Timothy said suddenly. The warning note. It was meant to make Mr. Prowse think Mr. Leach was threatening him, but Mr. Leach didn't write it. No, Miss Marple agreed. Someone else wrote that note. Someone who wished to establish Mr. Leach as the obvious suspect while they prepared their own plan. Thomas Hargreaves spoke for the first time since the gathering began. Are you suggesting there was a third party involved? Someone beyond Prowse and Leach? I am suggesting, Miss Marple said, that we have not yet identified all the players in this tragedy. Someone else benefited from Alfred Prowse's death. Someone who saw his investigation as a threat, not merely to Jonas Leach, but to themselves. And until we discover who that person is, justice will remain incomplete. Inspector Slack's face was dark with frustration, but also with grudging respect. You're saying the case isn't solved. I'm saying, Miss Marple corrected gently, that the truth is more complex than we first supposed. Mr. Leach will face justice for his theft. But the murderer, one who planned and executed this crime with such careful calculation, remains at large, for now. She looked once more at the assembled group, her eyes moving from face to face with that peculiar, penetrating quality that seemed to see beyond surface appearances to the hidden truths beneath. But I have faith, she said softly, that human nature, which compels people to commit such terrible acts, also compels them toward confession. The burden of guilt is heavy, particularly for those carrying it alone. The truth will emerge in time. It always does. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple remained for a moment in the church, looking at the choir stalls where Alfred Prowse had died. Somewhere in this village, someone carried the knowledge of what they had done. Someone who had transformed a holy night into a scene of murder, who had used the cover of worship to commit the ultimate sin. She thought of the title of that final hymn, the one that was never sung, Silent Night. How appropriate, she reflected, that silence should mark not peace but death, not reverent abhorrence, but wickedness. The snow had begun falling again outside, covering the village in fresh white. But beneath the beauty, Miss Marple knew the truth remained, waiting like spring beneath winter's blanket for its appointed time to emerge.